Now, it's quite interesting and difficult sometimes when you're trying to write and when you're trying to think through concepts, because you're never quite sure whether you're just simply repeating yourself, whether you're repeating other people's work, whether there's anything of interest and whether anything new in what you're saying. And I came across something when I was reading through Deleuze's letters that gave an interesting set of criteria as to the way in which something might be. I mean, he uses the phrase worthy of a book. He uses this phrase worthy quite often. It's not a phrase I particularly like. But he has three criteria. This is in a letter to a guy called Arnaud Villani. This is in the Letters and Other Texts book by Deleuze that I was showing you earlier. And the three criteria are a polemical criteria, an inventive criteria, and a creative criteria. So the first, the polemical criteria, is there an error in the existing text, in the existing theories that you want to try and deal with? And I'm sure if I was to reflect on our work, mine and Eric's work, the error is not just in seeing the human and nature as somehow separate, but in seeing somehow the idea of the drive as something in the human. And what we're trying to work with is this idea that the drive fundamentally is breath, and that this drive of breath is not the breath simply that we take as a particular organism, or even another sentient animal might take, but the very breath of the earth itself, and the way in which the earth itself breathes, and that this is the fundamental kind of idea of drive. Now, drive quite often is taken to be something fairly human. Most people kind of understand drive to be slightly separate from instinct, which an animal might have, and to be something that's kind of specifically human in that it kind of arises as a kind of collection of elements, primarily a collection of the elements that we might call instinct, and on the other hand, the ideas that we have in our heads, the images that we might have in our heads. And so the drive is a kind of combination of these, the way in which these things play out as human. And this problem of organizing and thinking of the drive as human always places everything else into a passive situation. It always places us somehow in the situation of being the ones that know, the ones that can control, and the ones that can organize. And the alternative to just kind of turn us into results or effects, sometimes a materialist dynamic, a way of describing the world, we might almost say scientifically, a way of describing us, for example, in evolutionary psychology, as just the result of a series of evolutionary decisions that are made. That's phylogeny that was mentioned in there. That alternative turns us again into something passive now, and outside of us is the processes that are forming us. And one of the things we wanted to do is explore how, when Fanon introduces this concept of sociogeny, when he introduces this idea that there is a lineage and a development of societies, and that actually taking this into account, taking this seriously, not just historically, but taking that seriously in terms of the drives, it produces a different relationship, because the sociogeny pushes us to think of our social, not just in terms of the human social, but as a social that's far wider than that, a social that is intimately connected with the earth in terms of the way it organizes and colonizes the earth, but that is also contingent, it's also capable of change. Whereas if we just take the human to be kind of a product of phylogeny and ontogeny, of these evolutionary dynamics and these specifics of how an individual grows up, we still find ourselves kind of caught in a situation in which we're products of scientific laws, and society and the social, and the way in which society operates is pushed aside. So the error perhaps, and this is me just reflecting at the moment, the error perhaps that we're looking at is the error of thinking the drive as human. If there's been something forgotten, this is the second criteria of Deleuze in his Worthy book. Remember, there are three criteria: the polemical, the error of existing text, the error of an existing text, the inventive, that something's been forgotten, and the creative, a new concept. If there's something forgotten, then I think that is possibly the idea of the chokehold, this idea that in fact we're not I would say we're not free, although that word is problematic, but that we're not outside of a slavery, outside of a colonization, outside of a situation in which there's something that has us, and that particular way of being had is not organized around the image of chains, but it's organized around the image of actually being choked, and we think that might be something that's being forgotten. When we hear and when we read political theory, quite often it's in an abstract sense of a kind of future well-organized society, or it's in the way of describing differences that we might have inside our society and how to overcome them, or it's in the way of describing errors or mistakes that our society is making. Well, I mean, all of those things are kind of important, but it seems that one of the things that's often missing or often kind of forgotten here is that the way in which our society operates isn't neutral. It places us into a situation in which we are being choked. And this, I think, for me, is particularly kind of indicated in the way in which our relationship to work is organised inside capitalism. One of the kind of conditions of the development of capitalism was the enclosures movement. And one of the points of the enclosures movement was to remove the capacity to be self-sufficient, remove the capacity to breathe, if you like, and to place us in a situation in which there's always somebody kneeling on our neck and pushing us to work, because if we don't go to work and we don't engage in the culture of exchange value, in the culture of money, if we don't do that, then we can't eat. And so the very idea of being self-sufficient is actually something that has to be removed. You're not allowed, unless you're very lucky and you manage to escape to the margins in some sort of way, you're not allowed generally to be self-sufficient, by which I mean not having to work. Only the bourgeois and the rich are enabled into that situation. And that forcing us into a particular way of having to live, that necessity of having to get a job, and all those kind of dynamics that we face, the necessity of having to get money, the necessity of having to work in order to eat, that's not a neutral thing. That's a chokehold. It's someone's hand around our throat, pushing and holding us in that position. And it produces a whole series of distortions of the drive, this drive of the breath, of being able to breathe freely. And it's not surprising in many ways that there are huge amounts of techniques and attempts to develop a capacity to breathe, something that would almost seem to be, the very ground of our existence. And yet we constantly have to come across techniques of having to learn how to breathe. Techniques that can be and should be deployed because they're incredibly powerful, but the condition of those techniques being powerful is that somehow we cannot breathe. And that, I think, needs to be taken a lot more seriously. And recently, of course, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and with, as we started a lot of our project after Eric Garner's death, with the kind of relationship to that phrase, I cannot breathe, this is beginning to be organised inside the collective, wouldn't say unconscious, the collective conscious, and it's beginning to be remembered, and we want to kind of push into that and develop that. So that's perhaps what we think is forgotten. What we think of as a new concept, well, we're calling it retching. Retching is this idea that the wretched of the earth, what Fanon calls the wretched of the earth, those that are colonized, the wretched of the earth, can only liberate themselves through encountering and connecting with the wretched earth, the earth that itself has been colonized and turned into a wretch. An earth that's colonized, as we see in that piece of work by Asao Hishimoto in the nuclear explosions, an earth that's the colonization of which cannot be seen immediately. The process of that, the sociogeny, the development of that, has to be seen at a different scale quite often, and we have to try and work at a different scale, a scale that history can sometimes give us slight access to, but the scale of the development isn't sufficiently encountered often through history. We need to encounter it in the same way that we might encounter the development evolutionary of a particular genetic line or a particular organism. We need to encounter the earth not as a kind of passive passive sphere upon which people live, but as something that's actively formed, as though there are kind of invisible hands moulding it and structuring it, and organizing its lines. If you see the Earth from the space station, for example, which is a fantastic sight, I mean, there's some really amazing videos of this, as the space station passes over the Earth. At night, what you see are strings of lights operating all across the Earth as the lights of the cities come on. And it looks like a virus. It looks like a kind of intimate, curious LED show. It looks like something organic and living, and it is something organic and living. It's a formation, a sociogeny of the Earth that's taken place, and that is, as some people argue, accelerating. Whether that is the case or not, I'm not sure. The same things can be seen when we think about the idea of the Great Wall of China being able to be seen from space, or the desertification of certain spaces. These are both natural and social products. They're colonizations that colonize humans and the Earth at the same time, and the alliance that needs to be formed is not simply between different humans, but it's an alliance that must intimately connect up with the idea that the Earth has been colonized. And so perhaps that's that new concept. We are yet to fully work that out, and we're working on the second part of our book at the moment, and I'll probably come back to some of this in various different points in later weeks.